Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Jose Arnulfo Cabrera, and I'm the Director of Education and Advocacy for Migration at the Ignatian Solidarity Network. For over 17 years, the Ignatian Solidarity Network has been uniting the Jesuit network and larger Catholic Church to build a more just world through faith based social justice formation, education, and advocacy. In the last few years, migrants have faced policies like metering, remain in Mexico, Title 42 that have deterred them from seeking asylum. Migrants across border cities in Mexico have organized themselves to fight back against these horrible and dehumanizing policies. The Ignatian Solidarity Network has joined the calling with the Kino Border Initiative and the Save Asylum Coalition to come together and fight against these horrible and dehumane policies. Today, you're going to hear a bit of a wrap up, or a bit of a of update of what's been happening. You might remember that earlier in the fall, we did updates from the border and talking about everything that has been happening at the border and the actions that the Kino Border Initiative and the Save Asylum Coalition have been doing to fight against these actions. Well, again, today we are here to learn more about what has been happening in the last few months since the September action that took place in Nogales, Mexico. Joining me today is my good friend Tracy Horn, a sister of Providence of St. Mary's of the Woods in Indiana, and associate director of education and advocacy for the Kino Border Initiative in Nogales, Sonora, and Arizona, where she also lives and has worked since 2019. Sister Tracy has ministered with Latinx migrant communities in a variety of contexts for over a decade. She previously worked as a teacher and then a community organizer with a focus on voter access, deportation defense, court accompanying with migrants, and detainees and ICE from local law enforcement. Sister Tracy recently celebrates 7 years as a religious sister. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you so much for having me. It's
Oh,
good to
thanks.
connect again.
Yeah, thanks for having us, and um, looking forward to having a conversation and learning more about what's been going on. Like I mentioned, we last time we did this, we were talking about the 25th action that happened in Nogales, um, and and so now I'd love to hear more about what's going on and how we can continue to work and how folks can advocate to fight against Title 42.
Absolutely. So, first, I just want to appreciate all of the different people, faith leaders, and students and parishioners from all across the country who have supported us, who held vigils and prayers, and people who even traveled down to be with us here at the border. It means a lot. And, I know every time we gather with the migrants who are organizing here for justice, it's a source of comfort and encouragement for them. So yeah, on September 25th, there were about 600 migrants and some faith leaders and others who gathered on the Mexico side in Nogales, Sonora, Mexico, and then about 100 people who gathered on the US side to raise our voices in prayer. And what I'd really like to do is to share a clip from one of our migrant leaders. Her name is Dulce. She's a mom of two small children who is still here waiting for asylum in Nogales. So I'm just going to share and interpret a little bit from her perspective as someone who has been leading the charge on this movement for justice.
Empezaron ellos con una marcha el 25, yo ahí me incluí en esa marcha hubieron testimonios, en esa marcha hubo gente de Estados Unidos, hubieron abogados, fue muy bien organizada.
So we started with a march on September 25th, and I was part of that march. There were testimonies, there were lawyers, there were many different people, and it was very well organized.
Se hizo desde una plaza que se llama Miguel Hidalgo y de ahí caminamos hasta lo que es la línea. Ahí en la línea nos encontramos con gente de Estados Unidos esperándonos del otro lado del muro.
And we started at a plaza called Miguel Hidalgo, and we marched from there to the border where there were people waiting for us on the US side.
Ahí fue algo muy bonito, muy espiritual. Después de esto nos entregamos 15 familias. 15 familias nos entregamos. Quiero recalcar algo, que ese día que nosotros estábamos haciendo la marcha estaba lloviendo muy fuerte en la mañana, en la tarde mucho calor y en la noche otra vez lloviendo.
And it was really beautiful. It was, for me, it was a spiritual moment when we met there on both sides of the border. And there were 15 of us families that decided to turn ourselves in to immigration to request asylum. And I have to tell you something, that day it was raining super hard. It was raining in the morning, and then it got hot, and then it was raining again in the evening.
Cuando unos, por ejemplo, en mi caso, yo vengo con mi hijo, tiene 2 años, y tenerlo con una sombrilla abrazado era algo muy fuerte.
And for me, I came with my son who's 2 years old. And so I was walking with him, and I was holding him and had my umbrella as well. So it was really tough.
Otras familias venían también mojándose, gritando que queremos este asilo, haciendo porras. Después de ahí nosotros entramos a la garita, nos metimos por el cruce peatonal y después de ahí pedimos el asilo. Desgraciadamente hubo una respuesta muy mala de los agentes de migración.
And so all of the families that were around were getting wet. We were yelling chants, and then from there we went to the port of entry. And that's where we wanted to ask for asylum. And unfortunately, the response of the officials was not positive.
No quiero decir que nos ofendieron o que nos dijeron algo que no, pero una respuesta a nosotros al pedir asilo, decir, tengo a mi hijo, tiene 2 años, yo vengo sin nada, es una marcha pacífica, es una marcha que estamos pidiendo por un derecho que por ley nos corresponde, que nos están quitando.
And so I don't want to say that they were offensive, but the kind of response they had, you have to think about someone like me with my son who's 2 years old, and we were having this peaceful protest and protesting for a right that we have that they are taking away from us.
Todavía no pasaba nada de la apertura de frontera para la gente de viajes no esenciales, y su respuesta era como de, no hay.
And so, even now they've opened the border for non-essential travel. And so those people are going through, but for us, they just keep saying, there is none, there's no access to asylum. And so, Dulce, who was sharing here, is just one of many leaders who are working for asylum here and have been persevering. And what I would add to kind of her observations is that the migrants, the first family that went to the port of entry to request was accompanied by the Tucson Bishop, Edward Weisenberger, who then processed with us to the port and was there with that first family. And it was a young woman whose husband was actually murdered by the mafia just a few months ago. And after the rest of the family had already fled death threats. And so she was there with her 2 small children, 6 years old and 3 years old. And when the family requested to access the asylum process, the Customs and Border Protection officials not only denied them, but they actually closed down the entire port of entry. So they pulled a lever that lowered down a metal gate, and they actually had to pull a child out from underneath it as it was going down. And I think we were all really surprised at how exaggerated that response seemed to a young woman with her children that's simply seeking protection in the United States. So when that happened, we gathered the other families to discern, did they still want to present at the port of entry after what had happened? And, I figured with small children, and what Dulce was describing is absolutely right. It was just pouring rain, and we'd been outside for hours. So I thought the families might say, that's enough for one day. But I remember looking at one of the dads, and he surprised me because he seemed like, why would you even ask that question? And he said something like, what else can we do? Our only hope is to keep fighting for this right that we have. So every one of the families who originally had signed up to to request access to asylum that day got in line to wait for the port to reopen, which it did about a half an hour later. And so the response, Dulce mentioned a little bit, but there was kind of a range. Some saying, they were sorry, there's nothing they can do, and then others simply ignoring their presence. And each family was accompanied by a faith leader in that process. And I remember at one point, a mother was weeping as she was explaining to the Customs and Border Protection officer that was just about 2 feet away from her face. She was explaining how members of her family had been kidnapped, and the officer was simply ignoring her. And the faith leader accompanying her said to the official, "Could you please acknowledge her presence?" And I think for me, that moment really symbolized what we were about that day and what we're still about, which is making sure that people fighting for safety for their families can be seen and can be heard. I think that, Jose, when I think about what's happening now as we continue, 2 months after that protest, that is still the struggle. That CBP official, in my mind, really embodied what the Biden administration continues to do, which is turning a blind eye to people who are seeking asylum at the US-Mexico border. They're pretending not to see, not to hear these families, even as other people are crossing freely back and forth. And so in that, for us as people of faith, it's really clear that their humanity is being denied. Of course, their legal rights as people seeking protection, but also just their humanness. And so the idea of the Biden administration, the idea of those officials is if we simply don't acknowledge migrants' presence, if we pretend not to hear them, they'll go away. But I can tell you that's not the reality. It's not possible for people who are fleeing some of the things that migrants have shared with me here. For example, if I was an LGBTQ person whose partner had been murdered for being gay, I wouldn't have anywhere to go. If I was someone whose family had been targeted by organized crime and I was waiting in the same country that I'm fleeing, my family couldn't just go away. And so, the migrants have continued in that spirit of being, demanding to be seen and heard. And after September 25th, they were present at the port of entry every day for a week, insisting that their humanity be recognized and insisting on a response. So every day for 7 days after that, and then weekly throughout October, the migrant organizers held vigils and presented. Families continued to request access to asylum at the downtown port of entry. And almost every day for that first week, officials continued to close down the port, sometimes even just when they saw us coming from a distance. And I think that our executive director, Joanna Williams, said it best when she described that response. People refusing, shutting that gate is easier than seeing people and hearing, because then we have to open our hearts to what people are experiencing and recognize the responsibility that we have as well.
Yeah, thank you. It's so hard to sometimes hear this and to know how people are willing, like you said, like Joanna said, that they're willing. They rather just close the gate. They rather close the door on someone than try to see them for who they are, see their humanity, and just deliver that tiny bit of compassion. Um, it's it's just hard to know that exists, and I think especially because it feels like we have been fighting for this and these policies have denied families so long that for me at least, I almost can't remember when people were able to seek asylum. People were able to go through the process, even if the process itself there were so many problems. They had issues, um, but now you can't even attempt.
Yeah, that's right.
So, um, what is going to be happening on November 8th?
Yeah, so we had another, actually, the migrants organized sit-in all day on November 8th when we learned that that was the date the government set to actually open travel between the US and Mexico, non-essential travel. And so, as we've talked about here before, the border was never really closed. I, as a US citizen with my passport, have been able to cross back and forth basically whenever I want throughout the pandemic without showing a vaccination card, without a COVID test, without a temperature check. And and so really, realistically, the border has never been closed, but there are certain groups of people who have been excluded from that. And one group is people who have visas. And so on November 8th, the government decided to open the ports of entry at the US-Mexico border to people who are vaccinated and have visas for non-essential travel. And so you can imagine how that felt for the folks who are here to learn, someone who lives here in Nogales, Sonora can cross the border and go shopping or cross for tourism reasons. But I'm still excluded from that welcome. And so obviously there are lots of families here locally who were rejoicing, and we rejoice with them because their family had been separated. There are families that, hadn't been able to get together because the people living on the Mexico side had visas, but they couldn't cross yet. So there is that part of it that, we can rejoice with those people, but at the same time, how that feels for the folks here to see all of these cars lined up, to see all of these people who are crossing, and know that they're not included, that, their travel is not seen as essential, which for us has been an issue since the beginning of Title 42 and the beginning of closing the border to asylum seekers last March.
Wow. How, and I know you touched a little bit about it, but could you just help us, especially folks for me who, we don't live at the border, we don't see this every day, but could you just expand a little bit more on like how is this continuing to affect families in Nogales and across the border? Because I imagine that this isn't just happening in Nogales, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And I think, we're continuing to see families just facing these impossible decisions. And I think for me, one of the hardest moments, we're still receiving people here at our migrant center who are traveling north, fleeing violence. People migrate for a variety of reasons, but we still are seeing people seeking asylum who don't have access to a process. So just today, I talked to a Venezuelan family that arrived in Nogales, looking for some way to access asylum based on the political persecution they were fleeing, and being part of protests and then being labeled as an enemy to the government. Many of us know about that situation in general. And I had to tell them there's no process right now. There's no process that exists at the border for you to access asylum. And so those are really tough moments because then, a family is talking through their options. They don't feel safe here in Mexico. People who are from other countries are targets in Mexico, especially migrants. And, they could be targeted by organized crime. And they, like many families, can't go back to where they're from because their lives are at risk. And so they're in the middle. So they, as they were talking about this, were considering, well, I guess our only option is to cross through the desert to be able to access asylum since there is no access at ports of entry. So just, it's just really hard to understand how we can't have any process for people whose lives are at risk. And even then there's no guarantee that they would actually be processed. And, we know this firsthand because we receive families who are being expelled through Title 42 after telling multiple agents that they're seeking protection from life-threatening persecution. So those expulsions continue, and this means that people are suffering inhumane conditions. And so you have the two issues, which is, there's no process for people who are coming, who want to present a port of entry and want to access this process of asylum. And then you have people that are, say, well, if there's no process, I'll cross through the desert, and they're being detained and expelled. So this includes a Mexican mother who I talked to just a couple of weeks ago, who attempted to cross through the desert and seek asylum with her kids and her husband. She shared with me when she arrived here that her family was detained, and a Border Patrol agent actually pointed a gun at her family And then in the place where they were detained by Customs and Border Protection, her husband, they were all exhausted from traveling, and her husband tried to lay down. And when he did that, a Border Patrol agent kicked him in the head and yelled at him that he had to get up. Then when they were being transported back to the border to be expelled, they said that when they were in the back of this vehicle, there was no air circulating. And they were really feeling short of breath. And so they, pounded on the back of the vehicle, asking the agent to turn on the air circulation. But there was no response for an entire hour. So when they finally got out of the vehicle, they were being expelled to Mexico. The children were literally gasping for air. And that's just one person's story out of many. But as long as Title 42 expulsions continue, as long as the Biden administration refuses to restore any process for people seeking safety at our border, migrants will continue to face these, impossible decisions, these dangerous situations and abuses at the hands of Border Patrol.
We do. What's next up?
Yeah, and I think, one thing for me, it's always important for people to just like raise their voices and talk about this. That's the bottom line. So if everyone who watches this video can talk to 5 people they know, people don't understand that Title 42 is a racist policy. So, this isn't a historical thing. It's really not new. This trope of migrants bringing disease, it goes back to public health inspection buildings that were set up to inspect German immigrants. It goes back to Irish Catholics who were said to bring disease in the 1800s. So for centuries, we've created this myth that migrants carry disease as a way to dehumanize people who are coming from other places, when in reality, the idea that simply because someone is a migrant from another place doesn't mean that they are more likely to carry disease. In fact, that's, it's false, and it's also racist. And so we need to talk about this. We need to talk about the truth that the US-Mexico border never actually closed. It was just designed to keep certain people out. And we have to talk about the fact that Title 42 has been particularly harmful to Black migrants, like the Haitians that we've seen deported, expelled by the thousands to a country that some would say is like a war zone right now. So it begs the question for us, we have to ask the question, why has this supposed border closure been handled differently at our northern border, where the people who are crossing are most likely white? And why is it that places where Black and brown people are seeking access to protection, that we are keeping people out? And so, I think the first step then, Jose, is like having the conversations, talking to people we know. I've been surprised by how many people who really, support immigration reform, who have been even on the front lines of, immigration movements, don't understand the implications of Title 42 and the fact that asylum, the reality for people here at the border continues much the same as it did under Trump. And so the first, that first step just being talking about it. And then beyond that, taking some concrete actions. So for example, this Friday, I'll be joining dozens of Catholic sisters with Network, Lobby for Catholic Social Justice, to ask the Biden administration to end Title 42, to just lift up the fact that it's immoral. And so I would invite folks to join in solidarity with me and with dozens of other Catholic sisters by emailing the Biden administration on Friday to echo that message. And so there's a link from Network Lobby. It's actually kind of easy to remember, networklobby.org/Title 42 email. And so, echoing that voice this Friday is something really concrete that you can do. And then the other piece to that is, we're really going to be encouraging our supporters, our followers, to then write letters to the editor. So, again, this goes back to so many people just not being aware of the atrocities that are happening at the border. We need more people in our communities talking about this, reading about this, hearing about this issue, and that'll really help amplify the advocacy. We also know that congressional offices pay attention to the content of local newspapers. So one way that you can jump into that is join us on Tuesday, December 7th at 7 p.m. Eastern time, Network is going to host a training to write effective letters to the editor. And so we're going to be encouraging people to join that and then to follow up and see how many, if we could get a letter to the editor in every state during the season of Advent to accompany Holy families seeking protection. I think that would be a really great goal. And, in general, if you're members of Congress, they have a role in holding the administration accountable. And I think we need to hold them to that and ask them, if your members of Congress haven't heard from you about Title 42 and asylum restoration, they should hear from you. And if they've already heard from you, then they should hear from you again. I would just say to take a cue from the migrant organizers here who were out daily and then weekly holding vigil and just being persistent about showing up over and over to make our voices heard. And I know Jose ISN created a great action alert that folks can tap into if they haven't contacted their members of Congress yet.
Totally. And one of the things that we at ISN are also, we're, as we get, tomorrow is officially December, and as we get closer to the different celebrations that happen in December, especially for me personally, my family, we celebrate Posadas, and maybe many of you here were part of our virtual Posadas last year where we talked about MPP, and my hope was always not to do Posadas again because that would mean people would be able to come in, but unfortunately, here we are again. We are going to, re-up our Posadas campaign, and this year will be for to end Title 42. Also, a lot of the stuff that Tracy shared, those links are check the comment sections, and I also shared in the comment section the link to sign up to join our virtual Posadas. And here's just a quick little promo that I have for you all. So, sign up for all of the different activities with Network, learn about how you can send letters to the editors, sign up to get the emails and videos of the daily Posada videos that will be happening for those 9 days. On the third day of Posadas, we'll actually be live streaming KBI's binational Posadas. So that we're really excited about that. So stay tuned to that. But thank you all so much for joining us. We want to let you all go so you can enjoy dinner or get ready for dinner or wherever time zone you are for the next part of your activity. And we please ask you to share this with your networks so they can understand more of what's going on at the border and hear ways on how they can take action, and especially all the things that are coming up in the next few weeks. All again for joining us, and we'll see you next time around. And Tracy, thank you so much for all the updates you had for us.
Thanks, Jose, for the invitation, and thanks everyone for your support. It means a lot, and I know the migrants here are going to keep fighting. So we'll see you at the Posadas.
See you all then.